If you have listened to this podcast for any length of time, you know that every year I set a reading goal for myself. And at the end of the year, I love to share my top recommendations for you. And I almost didn't record this episode this year because life has been crazy, getting ready for Christmas, my daughter being in a full leg cast after breaking her leg, and me dealing with some crud that does not seem to want to go away. But I decided I was going to record this episode anyways for 2 reasons, which I will share inside today's episode. Welcome to More Than a Milspouse, the podcast for military spouses who want to live with more meaning and less overwhelm. I'm your host, Christine, seasoned military spouse, mom of 3, life coach, and your guide to intentionally designing a life you're excited about as a military spouse. I'm here to help you get the clarity you need so you can get unstuck and unlock your purpose and potential. Because you, my friend, are more than a milspouse. You have something valuable to offer. And when you pursue the things that light your heart on fire, you trade frustration for fulfillment and isolation for a life of impact. It's time to discover who you are meant to be, because together we can change the world. J.K. Rowling once said, "If you don't like to read, you haven't found the right book." And I have to say, I absolutely agree with her on this point, because reading is something that expands our knowledge about ourselves and the world around us. And I know it can be challenging in the midst of our busy lives to find time to read. It feels like something that is just for people with spare time. But I think if you find the right book for you, anyone can find time to read. And there are endless ways to read now. There's e-readers, audiobooks. I've been told you can even get AI to read you books. And of course, there's the traditional black and white text in a bound book. So whatever your preferred format, you can find a way to incorporate reading in your life. So my first reason for recording this episode today is that I hope to inspire you to make a reading goal for 2025. Now, if you are wondering, how do I find time to read? How do I set a reading goal? Why does this matter? I have the perfect episode for you. In episode 86, I talk about how I started this yearly practice of setting a reading goal, how I fell back in love with reading, and how I make it a part of my daily life. I will have that episode linked in the show notes, along with all of the book recaps I've been doing since I started blogging almost 5 years ago. But today's episode is about what I read in 2024, and I hope I give you some ideas to get you excited about setting a reading goal for yourself in the new year. So let's start by recapping my year in reading. And the most interesting part of this year was that I read a lot at the beginning of the year and not as much at the end of the year. I definitely read more before we moved than after we moved. And some of that has to do with finding the rhythms and routines in a new place, adjusting to my schedule, and a lot of it has to do with finally getting time to write the first draft of my own book. I've been saying for the last couple of years, I want to write a book, but I never could seem to carve out the time to actually write. And then towards the end of the year, I was able to carve out that time, but while I was writing, I did not spend as much time reading. So when I look at my 2024, I had one goal that was new this year. In the past, I've just said, hey, I want to read this many books in a given year. And this year, I was like, no, I'm going to be more specific and say I want to read 24 nonfiction books this year because sometimes it's a much easier to read fiction. And I wanted to carve out time to read more nonfiction. Now, depending on how you look at it, I kind of did and kind of did not meet this goal. So I read a total of 53 books this year. I finished a total of 53 books. We're not quite to the end of December as I'm recording this, so I might finish another one. We'll see. But 53 books, 27 fiction books, and then 7 memoirs, and then 18 that were in the nonfiction self-help type space. So my goal was 24 nonfiction books. If you count the memoirs, then yes, I met that goal. If you count the learning self-help type books, then I finished 18 of those. So not quite 24, but I made a lot of progress because I have a long list of nonfiction books I want to read. And so I wanted to make sure I was making progress on getting through some of those books. Unfortunately, there was a lot that people have recommended, and I was like, this was just okay. It wasn't great. I didn't love it. So I don't have as many of those books to recommend this year because I just was kind of a little blah on several of those books that I did read. But when I look at the year as a whole, I'm going to tell you my 7 favorite fiction books and then the top 3 nonfiction books that I read this year. So in the fiction category, here were my favorites. Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmis. I loved this book. And then I saw that Apple TV had a miniseries, and I watched the miniseries, and I did not love that so much. I felt like a lot of the things they changed for the TV adaptation didn't add to the story, and if anything, kind of took away from it. But the book I really liked about a female chemist in the early 1960s named Elizabeth Zott, and she's the only female chemist at her workplace. It's historical fiction, it's thought-provoking, and it's entertaining. And it's just a good reminder of how much things have changed for women in the workplace. So that was the first book I really liked that I read this year. Number 2, The Measure by Nikki Erlich. And this book initially spiked my anxiety, but it was such a good read that I made my entire book club read and discuss it. It's one of those things that I think just makes for a good discussion because there's so much to think about in this book. It's the debut novel from Nikki Erlich, but I never would have known it was her first novel because it's just that interesting. And it follows the lives of 8 ordinary people whose lives are changed forever overnight. And it really gets to the question, what if you could know your fate? Would it change how you live your life? And I won't give it all away, but I will say that this is definitely a book worth reading. Number 3 on my list is Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet by Jamie Ford. If I have a favorite genre, it's most definitely historical fiction. And my favorite books are the ones that teach me something about a time in history or a people group that I'm less familiar with. And this is definitely the case for this book and the next book on my list. Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet is the story of Henry, a Chinese American in the 1940s, and his relationship with Keiko Okabe, a Japanese American girl. And it looks at what it's like to be an Asian American in the 1940s, and specifically the Japanese internment camps in the U.S. It shines a light on this period of history while also being a very sweet and meaningful story. Number 4 on my list is The Women by Kristen Hanna. Unless you don't listen to any talk at all about books, then you've probably heard about this book. It's probably the most talked about book of 2024. But if you haven't heard of it, go check it out. Again, I really did not know that much about the Vietnam War, and I don't think I paid that much attention to it other than knowing that a lot of veterans came back and suffered PTSD because of it. But I got to understand the conflict in a new way through this story. Kristen Hanna is a very gifted storyteller, and she paints a picture of not just what it's like to live through the Vietnam War, but what it was like for the women who served as nurses during the war. I feel like this book should come with all of the trigger warnings because it covers a lot of difficult topics, but it is a very compelling read, and it does a really good job of shining a light on PTSD and how it impacts people's very real lives, even after they return home. So definitely check out The Women by Kristen Hanna. Number 5 on my list is Tom Lake by Ann Patchett. Now, I don't know if this book would be on my list if I had just read the book, but I loved the audio version because it is narrated by Meryl Streep. And at this point, I've listened to a lot of audiobooks. I'm very familiar with good audio narrators, but it was really interesting to hear Meryl do so many voices for all the characters in one book. So if you are interested in this book, definitely go for the audio version. It was a Reese's Book Club pick, and it's a fun story to listen to. It takes place in the spring of 2020 when Laura and her 3 adult daughters all return to the family's orchard in northern Michigan. And over the course of the book, Laura tells her daughters her own coming-of-age story of romance, love, chasing a dream, and what she's learned about what really matters in life. Number 6 on my list is Wool by Hugh Howey. I also enjoy reading dystopian novels, but I came to this book the opposite way as most books. I actually started by watching the TV series and then realized it came from a book. So after I had watched the whole season 1, I came back to the book and started reading that. It is the Apple TV series Silo, about a group of people living in an underground silo, and that's all they've ever known. They don't know why or how they came to be there, but they lived by this very strict set of rules that govern how they operate, who's allowed to get pregnant, what jobs they're allowed to have, so on and so forth. And the one thing that you're never allowed to mention is that you want to go outside. So I watched season 1, I got curious, and like most TV adaptations, the TV story differs from the book. But in this case, I thought the TV series was very compelling on its own. So I went and I read book 1 of the series, which is Wool, and that's when I realized that season 1 of the show only covers the first half of book 1. And then I was like, oh, what happens now? So then I told my husband, and he had to read book 1, and then he started book 2. So then I had to read book 2 to catch up to what he knows. And I definitely listened to the entire book 2 in about a span of 24 hours. It's maybe not the best dystopian series I've ever read, but it will for sure keep your attention if you're looking for something fun to read. And then rounding out my fiction list, number 7, What Alice Forgot by Leanne Moriarty. Alice wakes up after a fall and doesn't remember anything about her life that has happened in the last 10 years. Some things are really surprising to her, like the fact that she has 3 kids. The last thing that she remembers is being pregnant. She also realizes that she's not as close to the same people that she was close to 10 years ago, but her memory loss turns out to be somewhat of a blessing in disguise because now she has the chance to think about what parts of her new life she actually likes and what parts of her old self she wants to reclaim. I liked this book because I read it for book club, and there's a lot of good discussion points in there. Some books are fun to read, but they don't really make for great discussion, and this book does. I also liked it because I related to Alice in the sense that 10 years ago, I was also pregnant with my oldest, and to think back to how much my life has changed in the last 10 years, it's a lot. There are some story elements of this book that I think were problematic, but it was still a really enjoyable read. Okay, those are my top fiction recommendations of the year. Now for nonfiction. Like I said, I wanted to read more nonfiction books this year, but I found it hard to read nonfiction at the same time that I was writing nonfiction. And, a lot of the books that I read were okay, but they didn't blow me away, as did most of the memoirs I read this year. They were entertaining, but not necessarily memorable. Britney Spears' memoir was probably the most interesting, but not necessarily the best well-written read. But if you're looking for a memoir, I found her memoir really interesting. But the 3 nonfiction books on my list this year are number 1, How to Be the Love You Seek, Break Cycles, Find Peace, and Heal Your Relationships by Dr. Nicole LePera. Now, I've talked about her before. She calls herself the holistic psychologist, and she is all about providing practical tools for you and I to deal with the trauma from our past so that we can break cycles and make better choices with our future. I also read her book, How to Meet Yourself, this year, which is about just tools for self-discovery. But I really liked How to Be the Love You Seek because it talks about if you want to have healthy relationships with anyone, really, then you have to start by working on yourself. Because if you don't know yourself, if you're not connected to yourself, if you're not showing up as the version of yourself you want to be, then you can't expect others to do that for you. When you put in the work to show up as the version of yourself you want to be the friend you want others to be for you, then you are opening the door. You are setting the stage. You are not only showing up for yourself, you're positively impacting everyone around you. And relationships really matter. Relationships are important. And as Dr. LePera points out, probably the most important relationship is the parent-child relationship. So it was good to read this as a parent because I'm also thinking about not only, what I gained from when I was a child, but then how I can be the parent that my kids need. So Dr. LePera shows us how to heal from the unmet needs rooted in our childhood and our earliest relationships, and how we can take responsibility for those unmet needs, and how we can use these tools to become better spouses, better parents, better friends, and better coworkers. The second nonfiction book on my list is The 12-Week Year by Brian Moran and Michael Lennington. I did an entire podcast just on this book. So it was a book that really stuck with me. And it takes the concept of annual planning, tosses it out the window, and gives you an execution system and a plan for pursuing goals, looking only at 12 weeks at a time. Your year, quote unquote, is now 12 weeks long, which means there's not enough time to get complacent or to coast or to lose focus. And your focus for that 12 weeks can be on whatever you want it to be. So whether it's a professional goal, whether it's a business goal, whether it's a personal goal, that can be your focus, but you're going to focus in on that thing for 12 weeks. And so what I love about this book is that it's not just for personal growth. It's not just for professional growth. It works for your life. And this is what we really need as military spouses, because sometimes it's really hard to plan a year out because you have no idea what's coming. So if you are looking for a way to grow, even in the midst of lots of uncertainty and change, this book will help you do that. And then third in my nonfiction recommendations for this year was Mind Shift. It Doesn't Take a Genius to Think Like One by Erwin Raphael McManus. I have decided that I love everything that Erwin Raphael McManus writes. I haven't read all of his books yet, but the ones I have read have given me a lot to chew on. They're not necessarily long books, but they give you a lot to where you just kind of want to chew on an idea. And this one was no exception. It's not long, like I said, but he has a way of taking concepts and breaking them down into easy to understand frameworks. And this book is all about the internal structures of success, how we think, and what the difference is between those who dream dreams and those that achieve their dreams. And he really gets into this question of how do we live a life without regrets? How do we unlock our potential? How do we live fully alive? And it begins by transforming the way we think. And Mind Shift will help you do just that. Now, I said at the top of the episode that I really wanted to get this episode out for 2 reasons. One, because I want to encourage you to set a reading goal of some kind for 2025. And I want to give you some ideas for books to inspire you to get started. Now, you may not accomplish the goal that you set, and that's okay. I did not accomplish my goal to finish 24 nonfiction books this year. But I guarantee you that you will do more if you set a goal for yourself than if you do not. Now, the second reason that I really wanted to get this episode out before the end of the year is that I wanted to let you know that I am taking a break from the podcast. No, it is not going away, but over the last 3.5 or so years of podcasting, I've almost never missed a week. Now, lately, I've gotten behind on my planning, and so it's been a little tricky with life stuff happening, like my daughter breaking her leg. But even in the midst of moving and TDYs and the general craziness of life, I have released an episode almost every week since the podcast debuted. But like I said, over the last few months, that's gotten harder to do. And since most of the making this podcast happen is all on me, I realized, hey, I think it's time that I take a break. So this is not goodbye, but I wanted to let you know that if you don't see a podcast coming out for the next few weeks, there is a reason for that. Usually I am all about content in January because I love the energy of a new year. I love the turning of the page. I love dreaming. I love the process of identifying what goals we want to set for our year and talking you through how you can set flexible goals for the year ahead. But this year is a little bit different. And this year, I'm giving myself a little bit of space to breathe, to take a breather, and just have a time to reflect without feeling like, oh, I need to deliver content. I'm not exactly sure when I will be back. I don't think it'll be too long, but I think this is going to be a really healthy time to take a breather. I talk a lot on the show about our need for rest, our need to take pauses, to make sure that we have what we need, that we are getting fueled and filled so that we can show up for ourselves and for those around us. And so I am practicing what I preach. So like I said, I don't think it'll be a long break. I don't know exactly how long it's going to be, but I wanted to let you know that is happening. And if you are missing hearing from me during that time period, there are literally hundreds of episodes for you to listen to help you navigate life as a military spouse and make the most of your extraordinary lifestyle. I will also be working on planning content for the year ahead. So if you have an idea, if you have something that you want us to have a conversation about on the show, feel free to drop me a line and share what you'd like to hear. Or you can just pop into our Facebook community and let me know your thoughts on the year ahead. Okay, thank you, friends. Thank you for being a part of the More Than a Milspouse community. I wish you peace and joy in the season, and I will see you back here again sometime in the new year. Until then, may you live filled, fueled, and full of joy. Hey, amazing milspouse, before you go, I want you to know that I love hearing from you. The More Than a Milspouse community exists to help you thrive as a military spouse. Figure out what lights your heart on fire and empower you to live with purpose and impact. You can have an incredible impact simply by heading over to iTunes to subscribe and leave a review. But your impact doesn't stop there. You can empower those around you simply by sharing an episode with a friend or neighbor, someone who needs a little encouragement in this military life. And if this episode was meaningful to you, spread the love by taking a screenshot of this episode and tagging me on Instagram so we can continue to reach more people, change more lives, and shift the way that military spouses look at life. Because we are better together. Together, we can change the world. Let's do it.